Welcome back. Once again, I'm working on chess puzzles. As you can see, I made it to 2020 last time, and we're going to try to do even better this time. Okay, the first thing I'm going to do is look for checks, then captures, then threats. I do not have any checks in this position. The king is on a dark square, so it cannot be checked by my light squared bishop, and my rook cannot currently make it to the back rank where the king is. I can check this king. Wow. My brain isn't completely connected, apparently. I can capture this rook, is what my brain wanted my mouth to say. It is on the 7th rank and looks like it's preparing to chop off all these pawns. However, I notice my opponent has made some sort of a strategic error by leaving all these other pieces trapped on the back rank. And in a game, I think if I were actually in a game and I were down this much material, as it stands, I'm down 2 full pieces. If I capture this rook, I'll still be down a full piece. If my rook were here on the e-file, that would be checkmate. So, since I don't have any checks, I do have a capture, but I also have a threat, and that's the threat of checkmate. So, like I said, in a game, I would just capture this rook probably without thinking, and then try to move this over in order to get down here. I don't know what, even if I took the rook first, I don't know what white could do to stop the checkmate threat. Let's see. If I captured the rook, white could move the bishop out of the way. Then when I moved the rook over, they could move the knight out of the way. And this rook would be guarding that square. But it requires white 2 moves to prevent my checkmate threat. And if I take the rook, they have time. So that's why I'm thinking that just moving my rook to the e-file is better, because then it's 1 move to mate, and they don't have time to move both of those pieces out of the way. Because they can't move this pawn. The king can't come forward. The king can't move over because of my bishop. This pawn can't get out of the way. The only defense white has against checkmate is getting both of those pieces out of the way so the rook can guard, or moving this rook over. Now, obviously, if I captured, they couldn't move the rook over, but I think we've already established that they would be able to move both of those pieces out of the rook's way. However, if I move my rook first, they don't have time to move both of those pieces out of the way. I think their only option would be to temporarily block with this rook, which I would capture, and then I would still be threatening mate. So that's what I'm going to try. Okay. All right. Just a simple bit of logic there. A counting exercise, which I have found out that a lot of chess is a counting exercise. How many moves before the opponent can get to the same thing I'm trying to get to, and the fastest way to get there. Or how many pieces are protecting a specific square. I do have a check, which is going to be, I'm going to try hard to make sure that's the first thing that I look for. However, I was going to say I don't have a follow-up, but I do. If the king captures back, which I assume that it would, so let's say rook to h1 check. It's the only check on the board. King has to capture. No other choice. King captures h1. Then I have a follow-up check, which is queen to h4. I don't think white has any pieces that can block or capture the queen there. The king would be forced to move back But then I don't have the follow-up after that because this pawn is not here. If my g-pawn were on g3 and I did the rook sacrifice on h1, this would be threatening mate, because when the king moved back, queen to h2 would be mate. Again, if the pawn were on g3. But the pawn is not on g3, so queen to h4 would be a safe follow-up check, but then the king is safe again. So I need something else besides that rook sacrifice check on h1. One idea would be, instead of checking first, would be to threaten first by moving the queen to h4 now. Because then the threat would be checkmate on h1. So, because the check doesn't work, I do have some captures, but I'm going to skip those for a minute because I'm still seeing this open hole down here. So queen to h4 threatens checkmate on h1. What could white do to get out of that? White could capture this pawn, which would be protected by these two pieces. And then the knight would be guarding h2, but it would not be guarding h1. And I could go ahead and take my queen to h1 and checkmate from here. So if I moved my queen to h4, they wouldn't capture with the knight. They could capture that pawn with the bishop. But again, that doesn't stop h1 checkmate. So queen to h4, what would white's defense be? They don't have any piece that can guard h1. The only thing then would be to give the king an escape route. If the rook moved over, that doesn't help because queen to h1 would still be checkmate. Pawn to f3, however, would provide an escape route. But if the pawn moves to f3, then I move mine to g3. G3, which guards the f2 square. And then I am threatening mate. Okay, so that's my candidate move. Queen to h4, threatening mate. I think white's only defense would be that, which would be met with g3, and then I don't know what they could do at that point. It would be mate coming on h1. But just in case, let me see. If I do that, they don't have any checks available right now. My knight is still in the way. So if I move my queen over here, they can't stop that by saying, by checking me. I don't think none of these pieces would be able to check at that point. The knight could do some sort of capturing here, but my queen would already be gone, and I would be threatening mate. They have to focus on that. I'm pretty sure that the first thing I did was say that this doesn't work. Because once it captures and I come over with my queen, it just moves back and I cannot follow that. I need the rook behind the queen. So I'm going to try that. Threatening checkmate. Okay. Are you serious? All that thinking? 4 or 5 minutes and it was one move. Okay. I honestly thought there would be more to it, like the pawn move and I would have to find this pawn move in order to get checkmate. That's what I thought. Anyway, 2030. I'm going to have to go check my statistics page when I'm done here and see if that's the highest that I've reached. I honestly have forgotten what my high score in puzzles is. Thank you for sticking with me, by the way. Hopefully you guys are learning something from this. This is interesting because I have a couple of checks, and I think one leads to mate. But let's follow them up. My closest piece to the king is the knight, and the knight can check on g3. However, I think that's the least forcing of the checks. Because knight to g3 check, the king can either move up to h2, or the king can move over to g1, or the bishop can just capture it. And I think I need my knight here to keep the queen from being able to access that side of the board. So, other check, that's one check, is knight to g3. The other check that I'm more confident of right now, just at first glance, is rook captures h3 check. It looks like it's nothing because the pawn would just take. However, my queen is also lined up with that square. So I think if the pawn captured, which actually would be the only move, see how knight to g3 check gave the opponent multiple choices as to how to get out of that. But this doesn't leave many choices because the king can't move. Can't move here because of the rook, can't move there because of the knight. The only option, wait, that's not the only option. I was going to say the only option would be to retake, but there is also the blocking option. If I check, rook captures h3 check. I had assumed they would capture first, but look, it looks like there is also blocking. However, if they blocked with the bishop, then I have, whoops, I'm doing that diagonal knight again. Knight to g3 check, which would, the bishop can't take because it's pinned by the rook, so the king would be forced here, and then I'm pretty sure that would be checkmate. Queen captures e1. So bishop wouldn't block, I don't think. Rook captures h3 check. Pawn captures. The g-pawn would capture back. Then my queen goes there. Queen captures h3 check. And that's mate. And this goes back to why I said I think I need this knight here to keep the queen from coming across. Because once this happens, and this happens, and this happens, if that knight wasn't there, the queen could block. As it is, the bishop would have to block. Boom. Pawn would recapture. Queen captures h3 check. The only legal move, because the king can't move, would be for the bishop to block. I'm going to put their moves in red. The bishop would have to block, and then and then I could put my queen here, and that would be mate. I'm going to try it. Okay. Bishop blocks. And I think that would be checkmate because the knight covers the other getaway square and no other piece can get in the way. Okay. Well, I just got a 3 in a row in this session. It says 5 in a row, but that's including the last 2 from my previous video. 3 in a row in this one video. That makes me hesitant to continue. 35's pretty high, but I've only gone 14 minutes, and I usually make these at least 20. So I'm going to click next. Oh. Cross your fingers with me. What do we have? We're down 2 full pieces. That's the first thing I saw. And up a pawn. So, oh, and that pawn is not doing well. Checks is the first thing we're going to look for. I have 2 checks. Three checks. I'm going to say this one's the bad one because the king just takes it. And there is a follow-up, but the knight would just block, and then I've lost a rook, and I'm 3 pieces down. And then there's this, and this, and and so on. Actually, that's mate, isn't it? Come to think of it, if I do a move, if I make any move that's not check, or any sequence that results in there being no more checks for me, I'm going to get checkmated with rook to h1 because the queen cuts off this diagonal, and so the queen's cutting off these two escape squares, so that would be mate. So every move has to be check. That's why this doesn't work, because the king captures. Even if I try a follow-up check, the knight would block, and then I don't have any other good checks, safe checks after that. My second check is this one, rook to h8, sorry, c8. Got to get better at naming these squares. Rook to c8 check. That gives the king a lot of choices, and I will just go through them. One is to come closer, d7, which doesn't really threaten my rook because it's protected right now. But wait. But then that would be checkmate, right? Rook to c8. If the king came closer, then queen to c7 would be checkmate. Okay. But the king doesn't have to go to d7. The king could go to e7, in which case queen to c7 would also be checkmate. No, because they could block. And it could also go to f7, where this doesn't do anything because the king can just run away. And I would not have a safe follow-up check at that point because, for example, here, the knight would take it. Okay, my other check that I saw last was this one. Queen to c6. The rook cuts off these squares, and my queen would be hitting that square. So the king would only have two choices of movement, left and right, d8 and f8. It would also have the choice of the knight blocking. Okay, so I have to consider all three of those choices if I use this check. If the king came closer, you know what? Oh my goodness, I just saw that my first check was a really bad idea because this bishop would just take it. Bishops move backwards, Will. Oh my goodness. Will is one of my names. Shan is what I go by on chess.com. But anyway. Yeah. Okay. So that one just loses a rook and there's not a good follow-up. We've established that because the knight blocks. This just loses a rook to the bishop. And even if I followed up with the queen, there are multiple escape routes for the king. I'm guessing they would use this one because when I checked again, then it escapes and I don't have a follow-up at all. Okay. So, queen to c6 check. Man, I should have stopped at 2030, huh? Okay. Where does the king go at that point? If the knight blocks, I can't do this because I just now realized the bishop covers that square. But if the knight blocks, the rook is covering that square, so I could come in here and checkmate is coming. So that's what happens if the knight blocks. Queen to c6 check, knight blocks, queen captures on d7, and the king's only legal move would be to go over one, and then that would be mate. Yes. Okay. So, if the knight didn't block, Remember we said there were choices. King to d8 would be one choice, in which case I wouldn't go here because of the knight, but I could go here to d6. Then the knight could block, but then I would take it and that would be mate. And if I checked queen to c6 and the king went the other way, I think I could just move sideways to d6, continuing to check the king. And it would have to go to g8. Oh no, I guess it could come back. Okay, but then I couldn't take the pawn because the queen's guarding the pawn. That looks like what it's going to do. Okay, because I think I've established that if they block with the knight, I have a follow-up that leads to mate. And I think I've established that if they move the king to the d file, I have follow-ups that result in mate. So I'm pretty sure that they're going to move the other way, to the f file. Queen to c6 check, king goes to f8 would be one of the three legal moves. And the best one, or the one that's going to make it hardest for me to checkmate. I would not follow up with the rook down here because I've seen the bishop now. I would not follow up by going there because of the knight and the king could capture it. I could follow up. The only checks then that I could follow up, I think, would be coming back, which I think would be silly because of this pawn, the b pawn, right? So we're not going to do that. So it would be this way if the king went to f8. Now there's no way to block, and the rook still traps the king on the back, so it would be forced to go further to g8. Then I would go to d8, where the king cannot move anymore, and the knight would have to block, and I would take it, and that would be mate. I think. So I have eliminated that check, and the bishop eliminates that check. It has to be the queen. Okay. And it did move the way that I thought, which made it a little harder. If it moved the other way, I think it was going to be easy. This is a little more difficult because the king is getting closer to over here. However, nothing can block this check. I think that's a fact. If the king came back at that point, that's mate. So I think it would go further. d6 check, the king goes further, but then I go d8 check. And the knight has to block unguarded, and I take it. Okay. There's nothing else makes sense except for d8. Okay, now I'm stopping. We've passed 20 minutes. Thank you for watching. Hey. Oh, you know what? Before I stop, let me check my stats page. Hold on just a second. It looks like I was right. You see right down here, it says my highest rating is 2040 that I just now hit. So that is my peak. Let's change this chart to all time. Okay, so I made really quick progress at the beginning, and then it kind of leveled out. You see I dropped back down into the low 1900s, but then I really started focusing again. And right in there someplace is where I started re-recording videos and broke 2,000 once more. And then these last couple of videos, I've made it to 2040. Thank you again for all your support. We'll see you next time.